Meantime, in Washington, the Trump-Muskian demolition project against perceived enemies proceeds apace. The new Justice Department has extracted from the FBI compliance to hand over details of 5,000 employees who worked on the January 6th investigations. Of course, they fear retribution and even termination. This follows President Trump's day one pardons for 1,000 rioters. Of course, many of them who were arrested, tried, convicted and sentenced in U.S. courts for their actions on that day 4 years ago. Heather Shaner is a longtime public defender who has represented dozens of those individuals, and she joins Michelle Martin now to tell us what she's learned from that work.
Thanks, Christiane. Heather Shaner, thank you so much for talking with us.
Nice to meet you.
Ms. Shaner, you know how we found you is that you were profiled in a New Yorker documentary called Public Defender. And the piece, and of course there was a companion piece that followed in the magazine that described your work defending some of the January 6th defendants. So I wanted to ask you about that. How did you come to have these clients?
I am what's called a court-appointed public defender. I'm not actually in the physical office of the federal defender. There's a small panel of attorneys who accept cases, and there were over 1,000 cases coming through the federal defender's office. So Michelle Peterson asked if I would take some. She was the head of the office in terms of the J6 cases. And I said I would, except I did not want to represent anyone who had injured a police officer.
Okay, so did you have any hesitation at all? I know you just said that you did have a red line, and that red line was you weren't going to represent anybody who had assaulted the police. But did you have any hesitation at all?
On January the 6th, like everyone in D.C., I was horrified and terrified and did not plan to represent any of the rioters. But as the days passed and I was asked, would I do it? I decided they also required a lawyer to protect their liberty rights.
How did the cases come to you? I mean, how many have you had so far? I think you've had, do I have this right, that you've had more than 40? Is that right?
About 45.
How did people receive you? Were people generally happy to hear from you or not?
Well, a few of the people at the very beginning only wanted a lawyer who would represent them based on the Constitution of 1776. And they didn't like it very much when I told them there was no United States, let alone Constitution in 1776. Most of the defendants were terrified because most of the people I represented were unintentional rioters, and they came from the Midlands and didn't really know what they were getting into on January the 6th. And they were thrilled to have a lawyer to help them. A lot of them were a little smarter, and they would Google and find out who I was. And when they found out that I gave books and the U.S. Constitution and reading materials to my clients, they either really wanted to do that or they thought they needed another lawyer.
How did you come up with that approach, by the way, of giving your clients reading materials and things of that sort? I know that I saw in the documentary, I saw that you have a lot of books, and so clearly you are a reader yourself. But how did you come up with that idea?
Throughout 40 years, I always gave books to my clients because when you're incarcerated, the way you can escape your prison cell is you can read a book and it can take you around the world. It can take you into the future. It can take you back through history. And it gave a lot of solace to my clients. For the January 6 people, it was an awful lot of civics education that they needed. And also, I thought they needed a little bit of information about other people in the United States and around the world to let them know that they were not the only people who had problems.
You said all of them were kind of unintentional rioters. Just say more about why you say that.
I say that because I didn't represent members of the Oath Keepers or Proud Boys or those who had the 1776, the 3%ers. The majority of the people I represented came from small towns in eastern Washington, central Florida, eastern Texas, Indiana, Illinois. They did not have an understanding of what was going on inside the Capitol that day. They didn't understand the Electoral College. They misunderstood what happened on election night when it would show Trump up and then Trump down. And they thought it was all manipulated by the deep state. And they didn't know that the deep state didn't exist. Most of them only had access to the internet and far right media. And if you repeat a lie often enough, these people believed it. So they came to Washington because Trump said, come on. And either they came to save America or they came because it was going to be a big party. And when they arrived, they apparently were served a lot of alcohol. And they also, an enormous number of people at the Capitol were smoking marijuana. So you had people who were a little inebriated. They were all intoxicated by being surrounded by people who agreed with them rather than family members and others who, since November, were telling them that their ideas were cockamamie. And they got all hyped on adrenaline, went into the Capitol, screamed and yelled, marched around, this is our house, this is our house, went home, saw that there were a lot of rioters who had done terrible things. And a large number of my clients were upset when they saw the destruction that other individuals had engaged in and the violence.
Okay, so when you said that they only had access to far-right media, I mean, if they had access to the internet, they had access to everything, which means they could have sought out other information. So they're choosing to focus on that particular sort of point of view. So I don't know, why should people have sympathy for that?
Oh, I don't say you should have sympathy for them, but you sure want to educate them. You want to listen to what they believe, question them as to their source of information and why they believe it, and find out if they're willing to read another point of view, to be educated a little, that there's more than one way to interpret the election, that there was more than one way to interpret what's going on in the United States and in the world.
In the New Yorker documentary, and then the piece that accompanied it, they profiled just two of the 45 clients that you represented, and they had different stories. Just as briefly as you can, will you just tell me about them? I mean, start with Annie Howell.
Annie was solicited in central Pennsylvania by a man named Frank Scavo, who was a far-right operative. He sent hundreds of people to Washington on January 6th in buses. Between the election in 2020 and January 6th, Annie had been very active in politics. She met Eric Trump. She met Hannity. She collected affidavits from people to prove there was voting fraud. And Annie was initially charged with felony and misdemeanors.
And Annie, as I recall, I think many people might know her name because she testified before the January 6th committee. And so if you would remind people, like, what happened in her case?
I was lucky to be able to negotiate down to misdemeanor plea for Annie. Judge Hogan, nonetheless, felt that her participation in the riot was intentional, even if she had changed her views since then. And he sentenced her to 60 days in jail. Annie, the first thing she did after we met was get a library card and started to read. And while she was incarcerated, she read a book a day. And she said her life was totally changed. And she was a big reader now, and that she had been more educated in the year since I began to represent her than in her entire life.
Your other client, the other client profiled in the piece was Jack Griffith. Kind of a different story. What's his story?
Jack came to DC from Tennessee. He was pretty addicted to the internet, and his goal in life was to have good abs and a lot of followers. And he came to Washington, D.C. for the party. And he videoed himself screaming and yelling and making all kinds of noise because he wanted to get internet followers. And he was zero political, zero informed, and he wasn't registered to vote. Jack was ever only charged with misdemeanors, and he was sentenced to, I think, 90 days of home confinement, and he never went to jail. Jack was offered books, and he never read anything, and he still didn't vote in the last election because he's still not registered. But he's still is, I think he's producing a video game in honor of Trump.
Among the people you represented, did you see, was there kind of a through line there beyond the fact that you're saying that most of them didn't really mean to, say they didn't, or at least the circumstances suggest they didn't really mean to be part of all of that?
The one thing that I think characterizes the majority of the people I represented, not all of them, but a lot of them, is there was some health issues. Almost every young man, old man, woman I dealt with, by the time you start out with pretrial services and you find out, do they have any mental health or drug concerns? Then you get to know them over a long period of time. Then they're interviewed for probation if they plead guilty. And there's a very thorough probation investigation, including medical issues. The two soldiers I represented had severe PTSD and depression and anxiety. The majority of the other individuals I represented had also PTSD from childhood trauma, ADHD, did not succeed in school, had a variety of other mental health issues, depression, anxiety, the most common one. So that was a factor that impacted their choices. They were isolated and alone during COVID. They became active with political groups during that time to help remove some of the isolation. I had one guy from upstate New York, Syracuse, and he was alone throughout COVID until he was solicited online to a far-right chat group, and it gave him comfort. And they had a break in their education and had, for whatever reason, in the last several years, chosen misinformation.
Heather, you know that one of President Trump's first official acts upon taking office was to pardon nearly all of the 1,600 people in connection with January 6th. And he, commuted others, regardless of whether they had assaulted police officers or not, regardless of whether they were convicted of conspiracies or not, and regardless of prior acts of violence. And it emerges that some of these people did have significant prior acts of violence. So I don't know. How do you feel now? I mean,
none of my clients wrote to me before January 20th and said, "Oh, Miss Shaner, can you get me one of those pardons?" Not one. Annie, in fact, wasn't interested and didn't want a pardon. Initially, when the pardons were issued, I felt like all the work I had done with my clients and all the education and friendship and love we had shared, and the documentary itself, the work it was doing, was invalidated. And I was very upset. I thought that the pardons are just a show by the showmen in the Capitol, in the White House right now. And it's a very bad idea. However, if in any way it leads towards reconciliation, then that would be good. If we can all acknowledge, as the judges did in their dismissal orders, that what happened on January 6th happened. And no dismissal order, no pardon is going to erase the day of infamy and violence. If we can agree that it occurred and then move on, then for my clients, if there's any benefit to them, so be it. The pardon cannot whitewash what happened on January 6th. And just as they say at the Holocaust Museum, document, talk about the truth, agree on facts, and never forget.
So before we let you go, what do you see as your role in this moment?
Well, I don't have any more January 6 clients except those who have become my friends. But I have a lot of young men at the DC jail who are charged with guns and carjackings and drugs. And I'm going to do whatever I can to keep them free of the draconian punishments that come down on your heads when you do foolish things because you're 18 years old.
Well, Heather Shaner, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
We return now to the United States with a closer look at what is happening in the White House and why. From ICE's violent crackdown in Minneapolis and Trump's threats to invade Greenland to the president's 70-minute speech at Davos, riddled with inaccuracies and verbal jabs. It's been a whirlwind of a few weeks. Our next guest writes that Trump's politics are not America first, they're me first. New York Times opinion columnist Thomas Friedman joins Walter Isaacson to discuss this rapidly changing world order with America and Trump at the helm.
Thank you, Bianna. And Tom Friedman, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, Walter.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney in Davos this past week gave a speech that I think is maybe the most significant or one of the most significant in 80 years since Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech. And it was about, he said, the end of the American-led world order. Is that what's happening now?
Walter, you're asking a critically important question. I think it could be happening. I think that there are people within the Trump administration who are acting in ways that will inevitably make it happen. But I don't think we're there yet. And I think there's a lot of pushback against it. if from nowhere else than the financial markets, because you saw how the market reacted so negatively by Trump seeming to engage in what Prime Minister Carney called a rupture, basically, with the Atlantic Alliance.
And Trump has talked about things that are America first. But you have a column saying he's not really dealing with America first. It's kind of me first for him.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the history of American foreign policy, Walter, which you have, going back to your Kissinger book, you would say that the kind of rupture, the kind of 180-degree turn that we're seeing by the Trump administration on foreign policy, or attempted turn, is the kind of thing you'd only associate with a major war or a huge economic explosion to the downside. What is so striking about this moment is this is not happening in the context of a major war or some kind of economic collapse. It's entirely driven by the moods, attitudes, and superstitions of a president who is more unbounded than any president we've basically had in the modern era. He's a man of extreme views who is basically able to govern, at least for these 2 years, with the Supreme Court, the House, the Senate, and the White House entirely in his hands, but not only in his hands, with a Republican Party that has basically chosen to surrender its responsibilities for advice and consent from the Senate and spending power from the House to the president. So we've never seen this combination of a president with radical views on foreign policy, unbuffered entirely by the administration. And that's why you get this moment where there's no war, there's no economic crisis driving this. It's just the impulses of one man. So I'm loath to describe this as a permanent shift, because I don't think underneath it is the plumbing and wiring that requires such a shift. I think this so much is combusting in Trump's own head.
When Carney spoke at Davos, he talked about, he took up the cause of Václav Havel, who talked about the collaborationist instinct and how systems only work if people go along with things they know aren't true. Like they put the sign in the window saying, "Workers of the world unite," in the old communist Soviet Union, even though they don't believe it. And he said it's time for the rest of the world, especially middle countries like Canada, to take the sign down and say, this is all a fake. We're no longer going to play along. What do you make of that?
Walter, by happenstance, I spoke at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver last week. And I was introduced by the director of the school. And in the process of introducing me, she referred to Prime Minister Carney's remarks in Davos, which had just happened the day before or 2 days before. And the audience just erupted in cheers. He got a lot more cheers than I did. Okay. And my Canadian host, pointed out to me that in their grocery stores now, they have marked with Canadian flags, Canadian-made products. This is really not only insulting to them, but frightening to them. But the old saying, the enemy gets a vote. Canada is not our enemy, even if Trump is trying to present them that way. The world will push back. It'll push back through markets. It'll push back by, look at the price of gold, just as a proxy. What is that about? Okay, it's not just people, worried about the instability of the moment. It's central banks around the world putting their dollars into gold rather than U.S. Treasury bills. So the world gets a vote. And Donald Trump can steamroll, Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton and his own party. But, the world will push back. It will resist.
One of the ways Canada is resisting is it created an agreement with China now on more open trade. Do you think we could possibly see China taking advantage of all of this and becoming, in some ways, a de facto leader of the middle countries?
China will attempt to do that. It has its own problems, though. Its own asymmetric economic relationship with so many countries because it's overproduction. So I don't think that would be easy. I don't think there's any replacing America. But the reason China and Russia, Walter, have always voted Trump emotionally, if not otherwise, is because they actually understand America's secret sauce. They understand our single most important competitive advantage, which is they have vassals, China and Russia, and we have allies. And we have allies because we've had this kind of reciprocal relationship with them, or a relationship where we are actually overly generous because we believe they've strengthened the system. And when the system strengthened, the biggest country in the system us benefited the most. So we have allies, they have vassals. And the one thing they have both tried to do for decades is, and that they've dreamt of doing, is breaking up NATO and breaking up the de facto American alliances in the Asian Pacific. And they never imagined a day where our own president would facilitate that.
One of the topics was Greenland, of course. And I thought when Trump was saying we may invade Greenland, I thought that was just his reality TV show thing. And indeed, I don't think he ever was thinking of invading Greenland. But wasn't it important to push our NATO allies to do more in the defense of Greenland?
We have had a historic relationship with the sovereign in Greenland, the Denmark government, in partnership with the Greenland government, that basically has allowed us, since World War II, to build and stock and deploy both forward radar and whatever fighter jets we want anywhere in Greenland. We've had that relationship. And the notion that either Russia or China are moving on Greenland is ludicrous. There's no proof of that. There is concern that as the ice melts, there'll be a mineral grab over the Arctic. But the fact is, we have had all the military access to Greenland we need. Now, Trump insists, well, because we don't own it, somehow we can't invest enough in it. Well, we don't own Germany and we don't own Japan, but we've had forward bases there, since World War II. So the whole thing is just a ludicrous diversion by Trump for whatever reason, or obsession, or obsession. And, this notion I read that, us silly people, we take him literally, not figuratively. What the hell does that mean? When the president of the United States speaks, you're not supposed to take him literally? When he tells you, if you don't give me Greenland, you'll see what's going to happen to you.
Let me ask you about the Davos European internationalist consensus over the past 60 years or so. Didn't it get some fundamental things wrong, including the rewards of globalization not being distributed fairly, that has caused this backlash and caused people like President Trump and others around Europe and the world to have a populist backlash against this?
Well, let's see. Last time I checked, more people grew out of poverty faster in India and China than any time in the out of absolute poverty than any time in the history of the world. Now, you can say that their growth out of poverty came at the expense of American middle class in the Midwest in America, and that's true to some degree. And as a country, we should have done more to protect these people, to undergird them. But I do think that globalization has its upsides and its downsides. And our job was to take advantage of the upsides and to cushion the downsides. We didn't do enough of that in America when we needed to. At the same time, if you go to a lot of these towns now, they have, in their own way, lifted themselves up and transformed themselves with new industries and whatnot. It's not perfect. It's nowhere near what it should have been. But what's the alternative, Walter? Should we have opted for autarky? How did that work out when the world went that direction before World War I? So, there's an easy straw man at Davos, and there's an easy, comfortable self-congratulation there. Both are extremes. But at the end of the day, the fact is that the world that we have today, the world that has been relatively more prosperous, more peaceful than any period in history, is so much a product of America being the way America was, and the fact that you had a U.S.-China trading relationship in the middle of it, that without both of which, well, I don't want to live to see that world where both of those things break down, because when that happens, you will miss this period when it's gone.
Another reason, I think, perhaps for the populist backlash we're seeing in Europe and America was immigration, and immigration going too far, it seemed. Did we get some of that wrong, and is there a way to try to solve that issue?
I think we got it absolutely wrong. And I think Democrats, and particularly the last administration, have a lot to answer for. I've been advocating the same message on immigration now since Trump really made it an issue in his first administration. I'm for a very high wall. I am for a very high wall from one end of the Mexican border to another with a very big gate, okay? Because unless you can assure Americans that we are controlling our border, you are going to lose a lot of them when it comes to immigration. I am super pro-immigration. I'm for the high-end, high-educated immigration, and I'm for any Haitian who can build a boat out of milk cartons and get to our shores. Wow, I want that person, okay? I want both the high energy and the high IQ immigrants. But we are not going to get them because we will not have a political consensus unless we can control the border. And that's why I urged in my column yesterday, my brothers and sisters in Minnesota, whom I'm so proud of for protecting their law-abiding, hardworking, culturally enriching neighbors, even if some of them are here illegally, okay? But at the same time, it's vital to me that Democrats, if they want to do well in the midterms, need to make it very clear they're for a high wall with a big gate, they're for legalizing immigration. Now, both parties, have had challenges on this, but the fact is Democrats came together under the Biden administration with Senator Langford of Oklahoma with a plan to actually overhaul all of immigration reform to give us what I call a high wall with a big gate. And Donald Trump killed the bill because he wanted to use this as a wedge issue.
You spoke about your most recent column where you speak as somebody who was born in Minneapolis and grew up in that area. Tell me, why is it coming apart so badly in Minneapolis? Why has this become the focal point for things?
Well, Minnesota is a classic example of a community that had some very rapid demographic changes, maybe too quickly for the state to fully absorb both immigrants from Somalia and more broadly. So that tension was there. At the same time, it is a community that has a legacy of a real social consciousness and wants to kind of make this work. And therefore, made itself Minneapolis a so-called sanctuary city that wasn't going to arrest or facilitate the arrest easily of illegal immigrants. And Trump knew it was a perfect place to try to, rather than calmly sit down, bring together, say, let me create a bill, for legalizing immigration and controlling the border. Let's work together with the people of Minnesota. He saw this as just a great way to pursue his own politics, which is the politics always of division, not addition. How do I divide? And so I win the election by 50.00001%. And that kind of leadership in this kind of hugely complex situation will give you this kind of explosion. But Democrats, just to say one thing, though, I really emphasize this in my column, Democrats need to understand, though, that there are a lot of voters in this country, and I'm one of them, and independents who are not good with just an open border. In my case, it's because I want immigration. I want more of it, but it's got to be legal immigration. And if we don't control the border, you will not have a national consensus for that. And that would be a tragedy.
Well, do you think that ICE has the right to be in Minneapolis?
I think there's no question that ICE, in theory, was created in part to control the border and to find illegal immigrants. We did that under Obama. We did that under Biden a little. We've done it all along. I'm for controlling the border. I'm not for what they did in Minneapolis, which was deliberate provocation of sending 3,000 people into a city to find not just illegal people, but to actually start pulling people out of their homes and stopping them on the streets just because they looked foreign. I look foreign. Heck, they could have pulled me off.
Let me read you something from your column that struck me as really strong words about ICE in Minneapolis. You say Hamas, referring to the Palestinian group that's been controlling the Gaza Strip. You say Hamas and ICE share one very visible trait that I never thought I'd see in the United States. Almost all of their foot soldiers wear masks. My experience as a reporter in the Middle East taught me that people wear masks because they are up to something bad and don't want their faces captured on camera. I saw it often in Beirut and Gaza. I never expected to see it in Minneapolis. Unpack that for me.
Walter, I don't understand. ICE is a federal agency charged with implementing the Constitution, federal laws. Why are they wearing masks? Why are they wearing masks? The Minneapolis police don't wear masks. The Washington police don't wear masks. Why are they wearing masks? I think it's something that really delegitimizes them, makes them look even more sinister, and makes me wonder what they're up to.
Tom Friedman, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure, Walter. Thank you.
In the United States, a federal judge has halted the shutdown of USAID following relentless efforts by Elon Musk, Doge guillotine to slash the agency. Musk insists no lives have been lost from the pause in foreign aid, but the reporting of our next guest proves otherwise. New York Times opinion columnist Nicholas Kristof joins Hari Srinivasan to speak about the harrowing picture he saw in Kenya and Sudan after the USAID supply lines were cut.
Christian, thanks. Nick Kristof, thanks so much for joining us again. Just about 2 months ago, the president wanted to pause all foreign aid assistance. What has happened since this government has taken those steps?
Well, I went to South Sudan to try to find out what was happening at the grassroots level. And Elon Musk had said that no one has died because of what he described as this pause to review aid. And Hari, within an hour of beginning my reporting, I had found the names of 2 young children, a 10-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl who had died because their medication, their ARV medication against HIV had run out and they couldn't get new sources. These were orphans and vulnerable children. What is a 10-year-old orphan going to do in Juba, Sudan, when the caseworkers are no longer available and he can't get his ARVs? Turns out that he doesn't get medicine. His viral load increases. He gets an opportunistic pneumonia and he dies. And over in South Sudan, I found that kids were beginning to die because of the aid shutdown, and that is likely to become a tide of suffering and death in the coming months.
But put this in some perspective for us. Our work on decreasing HIV transmission in different parts of the world goes back through multiple presidents.
The PEPFAR program against AIDS may be the most heroic thing that the United States has done in my adult lifetime. It was started by President George W. Bush in 2003, and PEPFAR has saved 26 million lives around the world. It's hard to think of any government program that has saved that many lives worldwide. The Trump administration has talked about continuing elements of it, but in fact, what I found was that things were being shut down, that even where humanitarian waivers were granted, that in fact there was no one there to actually manage it, to make payments, and so these programs de facto were being dismantled, and kids were not getting their medication.
But I think there's going to be someone watching here that says, why is it the U.S. government's job to fight HIV and AIDS in Africa and other places?
So I'd offer two responses. I mean, first of all, I think if you look at these kids and you understand that it is costing America just 12 cents a day per person to keep these children alive, then you think, boy, maybe that's a pretty good investment. And that has certainly been a bipartisan view in the United States for a long time. But even if antifreeze runs in your veins and you don't care about the moral argument for what we can do to save lives, then I think there's also a pragmatic argument of self-interest, that we have values, but we also have interests at stake. And we confront China with aircraft carriers, but we also confront China with aid programs. And that's so that we can have base rights, so we can have listening posts, or that China can, that we can get support for our sanctions, or that China can get support at the UN for its international efforts. And then, beyond that, we also protect our health in America, in part by global disease surveillance. It's a lot cheaper to fight Ebola in Uganda than it is in America. And, polio eradication, if that is one element that was suspended, the result is going to be more polio worldwide, and that some American kids are going to end up paralyzed or dying. Avian flu coming right out of a pandemic. We should understand the risks of a pandemic, and avian flu surveillance has been suspended, last I saw, in 49 countries because of the USAID shutdown. So, I certainly believe that that there's a compelling moral argument to save lives inexpensively where we can, but there's also an argument about just protecting our own interests and our own lives and our own people.
You worked with a think tank based out of Washington, D.C. and London, the Center for Global Development, to try to come up with an estimate of how many lives are at risk if we continue down this path. What did you find?
So, look, there's a lot of uncertainty, and a lot depends on how much aid is actually dismantled and how much is revived. And of course, there's litigation, and it's very fluid. But their best guess is that U.S. aid currently saves about 3.3 million lives a year around the world. And that's one way of thinking about how many lives will be lost if everything were shut down. In fact, I suspect some elements will be preserved, and so the toll will be less than that. But there is no doubt that there will be many, many hundreds of thousands who will die because we decided to shut down aid, and largely to finance tax cuts for the wealthy in the U.S. And also, Harry, I should just say that, we measure this in terms of lives lost, but aside from people who die, there's also an awful lot of aid that simply improves well-being, that helps girls go to school, that deworms children. We deworm dogs in the United States. You can deworm a child internationally for about 50 cents a year, and that child is then healthier, more able to work, more able to study, more likely to become literate. And, those programs aren't exactly life-saving, but boy, they're sure life-enhancing.
Well, we've talked a little bit about HIV. What are some of the other programs that you had a chance to visit? What did you witness?
Harry, one of the things that I saw was a program for malnourished children. And I don't know if you've, seen children starving to death, but it's just something that just is shattering these. Typically, it's young kids in the first 5 years of life, often just after they've been weaned, and they are expressionless. They don't cry. Because the body is saving every calorie of every bit of energy to keep the major organs functioning. And so they're almost like zombies. And it's, even though they're in immense pain. And I went to an area that traditionally had a mobile clinic, going there to bring emergency food rations to keep children who were severely malnourished alive. And a week before, that had been cut off because of the aid shutdown. And now, immediately upon reaching the village, I found a bunch of children who were severely, acutely malnourished. None had died yet. I'm sure that some of those will die. And maybe the thing that just wounded me the most, I went to an area in the northwest of South Sudan where traditionally there had been almost no health care, and women died in childbirth routinely, and newborns died as well. And then in December, a U.S. funded maternity clinic had opened up there and was saving women's lives. Not one woman had died since that opened. Not one newborn had died. And I show up and people, see me asking questions about the clinic, and they mistakenly assume that I'm somehow responsible for bringing healthcare to this place. And there's a woman in labor, and she wants to name her baby after me. The village elders show up under a mahogany tree outside, and they just effusively thank me, thank America for its generosity. They say women are now safe here. And what they don't know is that the U.S. had just cut off that program, and that clinic was about to close, and that women again were going to be bleeding to death in that dust, and that just broke my heart.
So what do you make of this juxtaposition that the people you're meeting on the ground are some of the poorest on the planet, and the person at this moment responsible for some of those cuts is literally the richest man on the planet? And I'm speaking of Elon Musk.
I asked people in South Sudan whether they had heard of Elon Musk, and most had not, which is a reflection of how remote the place is, how little access they have to world news. But what I saw was these folks who were struggling with their own health, with their own access to food, were looking after vulnerable children. And when they couldn't get medications, they were volunteering on their own time to try to get them to the hospitals, to try to get aid for them. And to see folks who have nothing trying to share their nothing with other kids, with other people, with vulnerable people, I found kind of inspiring. And I wish that would inspire the world's richest man at a time when he is dismantling American assistance for some of the neediest people around the world.
One of the critiques that the administration has had is that so much of the aid is going to international middlemen. Where is this sort of excess cost in delivering this aid through this pipeline and even down to the last mile?
I think that critique is absolutely right. Way too much aid ends up being digested by these Beltway bandit companies in the Washington area. And I think we get a lot more bang for the buck if more aid were going directly to nonprofits in these various places in the world. And USAID has recognized that there has been an improvement in providing direct assistance, but it's still, I think that is a very legitimate critique. And, I also think it's a legitimate critique that Trump and Musk have made that a lot of aid, isn't as effective as it could be, that the organization could use reform. But what we're seeing right now is not reform, is not making it more efficient. It's just taking a bulldozer to it and knocking it down.
Yeah, just last week, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State and now acting USAID, had said after a 6-week review, we are officially canceling 83% of the programs at USAID. The 5,200 contracts that are now canceled spent tens of billions of dollars in ways that did not serve and in some cases even harm the core national interests of the United States. Again, this is in spite of a judge ruling against the administration that these actions were unconstitutional.
Yeah, I think that there is, a widespread belief that the dismantling of USAID, an independent agency, was illegal and unconstitutional. I'm glad the judge intervened in that case. He restored email to people on administrative leave, but he did not actually restore those programs, and I'm not sure how feasible that actually will be. And, Marco Rubio was saying that these were not in America's interests. But in the past, before serving in the Trump administration, he made a very compelling argument that the Biden administration should sustain or expand these programs because they were the best way to challenge China, to win influence around the world, to advance American interests, not just our values. And I wish he would listen to what he himself had advised in the past.
You know, I think there's also sort of an us versus them framing sometimes. I mean, look, in the United States, we have somewhere about 36 million Americans who are living in poverty, 47 million who are food insecure, right? So when the administration makes the case that we should be focusing on assisting our own citizens first, what's wrong with that line of thinking?
I think we can do a lot more for American citizens. I'm right now in a rural part of the country that has real needs with addiction. But I would note that the apparent plan for dismantling USAID and saving billions of dollars is not to put that money into supporting veterans or fighting addiction. Rather, it seems to be two things. First, a preparatory effort to make a run at Medicaid and cut funding on Medicaid and perhaps Social Security, and then that these savings together would go to extend the Trump tax cuts, 49% of which go to the top 5% of Americans. So a lot of this is taking money that is keeping children alive for 12 cents a day and using that to fund tax cuts for some of the wealthiest Americans. But, you know, again, this is also keeping Americans safe from Ebola, from avian flu, from polio, from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is likely to spread. The U.S. has been a major funder against tuberculosis. And every case of extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis that comes to the U.S. costs an average of $500,000 to treat. It's a lot cheaper to deal with those and limit their spread in other countries rather than to pay $500,000 a case to deal with it here.
You have been writing about these topics of poverty and global health for literally decades now. And oftentimes you have made it a point to find people on different sort of ends of the political spectrum that can agree that these should be important priorities for the United States. What's happening with those voices now, especially on the Republican side, when they see what's happening, and yet maybe just 6 months ago, or a year or two ago, they might have been vociferous in the support of these programs continuing?
So, I mean, as you suggest, there are a lot of bleeding heart conservatives as well as bleeding heart liberals, and the evangelical right has done heroic work in this issue, along with the secular liberals. And I think that these folks still care about these issues. I think there's still a lot of members of Congress who deeply care about this, who are embarrassed about what's happening. But I also think they're worried about being primaried. I think they're intimidated by President Trump's inclination and Elon Musk's tendency to bully people, to denounce them online. And so they say that they're trying to work, behind the scenes. Aid groups, including Christian aid groups, are also nervous that if they speak out, that then there'll be revenge attacks on them and they'll lose more funding and hurt more people. So I've got to say that in reporting this story, I talked to a lot of aid groups, and it reminded me of my days reporting in China, that people were so scared to speak. They were so scared to use email. And it's kind of sad when groups that are truly doing the Lord's work are afraid to talk about some of the great stuff that America does, saving lives around the world.
You had really some compelling stories that you shared in the column that you just wrote. But since you've been back, have you had any updates about what's happened to any of those children?
So I've been in touch by WhatsApp with folks. Mostly these are former social workers in these efforts to support vulnerable children, and they were laid off. They've lost their jobs, but they're just still trying to do what they can on their own to keep programs going. And, unfortunately, the upshot is kids getting more sick. It takes a while for somebody when they aren't getting their HIV medication to get more sick, when people aren't getting food to get more malnourished, for an infection to come along. But that is happening. And so what I'm hearing is that there is going to be a real tide of disease and mortality in the coming months.
Columnist for the New York Times, Nick Kristof. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, how often do you check your phone? Maybe you're on it right now. I hope not. But more and more people find paying attention a real struggle in this world, which is dominated by distraction. But how does a lack of focus affect our society and our politics? Author and journalist Chris Hayes digs into that in his new book, The Siren's Call, and he tells Hari Srinivasan what he's found.
Christian, thanks. Chris Hayes, thanks so much for being here. Your recent book here, it's called The Siren's Call. It is how attention became the world's most endangered resource. Now, we have heard this age called the digital age, and we heard that data is the new oil. You're essentially arguing here that attention is the most important thing. Why?
I think we all are familiar with the idea of the digital age, the information age, and the importance of information and data, which is absolutely true. Information data are central to the forms of economic production and social life we live. But the thing about information and data is that it's bountiful. It's essentially infinite, and it's cheap because of that. There might be 10 or 100 firms that have your data, and to you, it doesn't matter that much. It's not going to affect your life. The thing that makes attention such an important resource is, one, information consumes it. The more information there is in your environment, the harder it is to focus. Information consumes attention. And two, attention is bounded and finite. It can be in one place or another. So if 100 firms have your data, that may not affect your day-to-day life. But if someone has your attention in a given moment, if you're on a crowded subway car or you're at your kid's school and someone starts screaming, or a siren comes wailing down the street, or a baby cries on a plane, that takes your attention away from you. So the finitude of that resource is actually the thing that everyone is competing for. And because it is at a fundamental level hardwired to be zero-sum, that's what gives it such intense value.
So you're saying, well, there's only so much time in the day that I have, right? I can't create more time. And as more things compete for that time, my attention becomes more valuable. So the more social media, the more TV channels, everything else that exists out there, that competition makes that millisecond even more lucrative.
Exactly. And what's interesting is it both has a market price outside of us. And there's a weird thing about its value. In the aggregate, when pooled over 1 billion users or 2 billion users like ByteDance and TikTok and Meta have, it's the stuff of globally unprecedented fortunes. When sold off in the second that you're loading an Instagram reel, it's fractions of pennies. Like that second or fewer you're looking at, its actual market price is nothing. But to you, it is the most precious thing you have.
You in the book, you really kind of go back into a little bit of psychology and biology. Well, and you point out that there's different kinds of attention. There's the kind that I voluntarily want to give. There's the involuntary one, the social attention. Explain the differences.
Yeah, one of the trickiest things about attention is that we do have this compulsory aspect to it. So if a siren comes down the street, if the waiter drops a glass in a restaurant, you don't get a say over whether your attention is drawn to it. It is drawn to it pre-consciously. It is compelled involuntary attention. That faculty is very powerful because that's the evolutionary origin of hearing the predator rustling in the bushes or the sound of danger, right? Then there's the voluntary attention we want to pay. And there's a kind of battle between those two things. One of the things I argue in the book is that competitive attention markets tend to drive towards compelled attention, which is blaring interruption. Casino floors, Times Square, the tabloid supermarket counter, right? When you have competitive attention spaces, they're trying to compel you away. And then on top of that, there's the fact that we as humans can be paid attention to. And that has a particular draw on what we pay attention to. If you hear your name at a party, it will draw your attention, even if you're not focused on the conversation. And they could have been talking for minutes and you've heard literally nothing they said before. And suddenly your name, and this is actually a finding in the experimental literature, your name and your name alone will draw you out of it the same way that a siren or a baby crying or a glass that's shattering will.
All right. Well, I will try to say Chris in every question now, just so you know that I'm talking to you.
I'm focused on you, Harry.
Exactly. So I wonder, look, I mean, this has been the purview of newspapers since they ever existed. Everyone has been trying. There's been the town crier, right? Somebody who'd stand in the middle of the square with the scroll saying, hear ye, hear ye. This is the news of the day. What's so different about what's happening to us now versus this, kind of, is it the increase of the commodification? Is it just the decrease of our time? What's happening?
It's a great question. And I should note, yes, there's lots of continuity in the sense that attention has always been powerful. I mean, when Mark Antony and Julius Caesar says, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, he's getting their attention for the purpose of a very important thing, right? Which is to persuade the crowd to back him in the wake of Caesar's death. So yes, there is continuity. Attention has always been a powerful resource. What's different now is the ubiquity. The sort of development of the smartphone in 2007 meant that we suddenly had a portal at all times to the sum total of attention-grabbing content ever created by humans anywhere on the planet over the course of history. So at all moments, there is the competition of everything ever made for your attention. That's pretty unprecedented. Second, the social aspect. Movies can't actually talk to you. TV shows can't talk to you, but the internet and platforms can. You can see what your mentions and your tags are. They are working off of the individualized form of social attention that grabs your name in that cocktail party at scale, engineered to make you pay attention. That's also new. And third is the fact that because of the overwhelming amount of information and the primacy of it to our economic, social, institutional, and political lives, there's just more scarcity, as I said at the beginning. So the competition is fiercer, and it's being extracted and monetized at a global scale it never was before. There has never been anyone talking to 2 billion people the way that Meta and ByteDance are.
What you point out in the book is really that, I mean, I see so many parallels to the sort of ultra-processed food industry and how we seem to be so much more addicted to sugar. But how do you try to get something like attention back?
I'm glad that you point to the food analogy or precedent, because I actually think it's the closest one here, in the same way that, we have certain biological inheritances. We like salt, fat, and sugar. If you unleash large global capitalism on that problem, it will give you Coca-Cola and fries. And you can sell that anywhere in the world, right? But the other thing about human beings is their tastes are almost too diverse to characterize. They'll eat a million different things because of how impossibly complicated humans are in terms of culture and cuisine and history, right? And the same is true of attention. We do have these two selves. There's the selves that's compelled by the casino floor or Times Square. And then there's the parts of people that go to 8-hour operas and will watch 4-hour podcasts and will read it. I mean, it's amazing. There's people read books. They buy and read books. And what an amazing thing in this day and age. People buy the hundreds of thousands of millions will do this. And so the question is, how do we cultivate market structures, government regulation, social and civic life to cultivate the diversity of our attention as opposed to the flattening? And the food example is really good. We have seen a revolution over the last 30, 40 years in the way food markets work, the rise of organic food and farm to table and farmers markets, and the moving away from the ultra-processed casseroles and jello salads of the late 1970s and 1980s, which are now almost a kind of punchline, right? We really have seen, through all kinds of different means, cultural, social, regulatory, legal, organizing and activism, a revolution in how we relate to food. And I think we're at that point in attention as well.
So how do you build an attention market that might have similar outcomes?
It's a great question. So I think how markets are structured really matters, whether your attention's being monetized or not. Like, group chats are a great example of a part of the digital life I really like. They allow me to stay connected to people that I don't live near, who I've known for a long time. I like when my attention is on them because I'm talking to my friends. Crucially, no one is monetizing my attention in the group chat.
Yet,
right? And this is sort of a key thing, right? The difference between spaces that are fundamentally non-commercial and spaces that are commercial. There are versions of digital life in the internet that don't have to be commercial. In fact, we had an open web, before we were dominated by the Web 2.0 platforms, in which open protocols, podcasts are a great example, which everyone loves. The phrase wherever you get your podcasts speaks to the fact that podcasts exist on an open internet architecture where they are not commercially bound by a platform attempting to monetize your attention. And they've given rise to this incredible flourishing. So rebuilding the infrastructure of the internet around non-commercially enclosed platforms attempting to monetize attention. And then I think there's real questions about the law and regulation and getting serious about regulating how attention is extracted from us and who it's extracted from.
So what happens to our kind of ecosystem and our landscape? I mean, you are a person who has been on a platform, cable news, for at least 10 years. How does a program like yours, a network like ours, stay relevant?
It's a really good question. I think, one of the truths of the attention age is that it's easier to grab attention than hold attention. And that's a universal truth. You can ask any person that you meet to walk into a room of 500 people and get them to, and ask them, say, you can use any tool you need to get everyone's attention. They could probably do it. But if you told them to give a talk for an hour that held their attention for an hour, well, that's a lot harder, right? One of the things we try to do is balance our attentional imperatives, which are absolutely there, and you're right about cable news, with another set of values. Like, the way to think about attention is as a means towards an end. And the end that we're trying to get to is educate people, enlighten them, give them the tools for self-governance and civic flourishing. The attention is a means to do that. What happens in competitive attention markets is that attention is just the means, the end in and of itself. That's the thing that's being sold. And I think having places where people have other imperatives is really important in whatever genre they're working in. There are people who do awesome stuff on TikTok and amazing podcasts and great stuff on short form video and on YouTube. Like, there are people doing amazing work in all those places. And the reason they're doing amazing work is because they have something they're trying to do other than just getting people's attention.
So should we collectively as a society be trying to moderate this in some way? Because it seems like most of the people that run the social media platforms are all too happy to go to Capitol Hill and tell the senators to their faces, please regulate us, knowing that nothing's really going to happen, or even if something happens, it's going to be so late and so long that technology and usage patterns have changed, and I'm still going to make a few billion in between.
I mean, they will say, please regulate us, but then if you try to do things like put on age caps, they fight it.
Yeah, so well, they lobby against it. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, they want to choose their own regulators and regulation, but I think that you need both regulation and alternatives. Like, I like the idea of regulating attention in some way, whether that's essentially like a hard limit on screen time, like a statutory limit. People are like, that sounds utterly insane and the most paternalistic thing. And it's like, people thought that about maximum hours at a certain point. That's what the Lochner decision, the famous Supreme Court decision, is all about, is like, if New York says you can only work 55 hours a week, is that paternalism, or are they protecting something essential about you? And does the Constitution knock that law down? I think it's worth thinking about that for attention. But I also think that you can't do that unless you're also nurturing alternatives that are like open platform civic alternatives, right? Because there are ways that we could communicate with each other. There's video does not have to exist inside YouTube. There are ways to have, open platforms in which people can do things. And I think, again, to come back to podcasts, it's so striking to me that has emerged as this kind of dominant form when it's the one that relies on the open platform. And I do think there's a connection to it. I think there's a connection between creativity and the openness of a platform.
You're rolling this book out at the beginning of the second Trump administration. And I wonder, having watched the election and the entire political run up to it so closely over the past decade, what did you learn from this election, and perhaps on what Donald Trump did well that the Democrats should learn from if they want to have a chance at running against, him, or I guess the party, with anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, there's a chapter in the book about public attention in the public sphere, and I talk quite a bit about Trump. And what I say is, he's got one kind of simple trick and insight into attention, which is simply that in the attention age, when attention is more valuable than ever, getting it and the quantity of it is more important than whether it's positive or negative. He is almost more than any politician I've seen willing to get negative attention, controversy, rage, protests, if he's getting attention. The first moment when he said, John McCain, I like people that weren't captured. And that was a very attention-getting statement. Yeah. That has been the MO. And most politicians don't like that trade. Most politicians are like, if the option is I go out there and I get attention that's negative or I get no attention, I take the latter. I don't want to make news. I'm going to keep my head down. And I think what he's shown, which is very optimized for the attention age, and I think Elon Musk as well, is that attention domination in politics is incredibly important. It might be more important than fine-grained messaging. It might be more important than advertising, and that you have to be willing to take downside risk to get it. And maybe people are gonna, maybe you take some of that risk on. But as P.T. Barnum said, as long as you spell my name right.
I mean, how much of that is him in a singular way? Because there have been politicians, even in the Republican Party, who tried to take that route and
it didn't work.
No. So how much of it is like, okay, well, Donald Trump was exceptional in somehow threading this needle versus, if you're writing a playbook for the Democrats in 3 years, what do you tell them?
It's such an important point because it's really true that there have been so many essentially knockoff Republican candidates who have lost eminently winnable races, being outrageous and polarizing and obnoxious and having the high negatives and losing races they should have won. Doug Mastriano and Kerry Lake and Herschel Walker and Dr. Oz and, on and on and on. There's been a whole bunch of them. In fact, it's one of the stories of the Trump era is that Trump manages to pull it off and Trump-like candidates do much worse than just kind of normie Republicans. So you're right that there's a real trade-off there. One of the things, though, I think is important is that presidential politics are just different than anything else. And that's the place where the attentional imperatives are at their most competitive and at their most important. And I think also Trump is able to pull it off because of something particular and genuine and authentic to who he is, which is that at the core of his being, he needs that attention and he isn't faking it. And that's another part of his appeal, I think. It selects for a certain kind of personality, a personality like you're seeing in Elon Musk as well, who I think is pulling off the same trick.
The book is called The Siren's Call, How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource. Author and host of podcasts and TV shows and attention grabber everywhere. Chris Hayes, thanks so much for joining us.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Now, whilst political turmoil continues to cause domestic chaos in the United States, the Democratic Party is fighting its own battles with internal tensions mounting, including in the Democratic National Committee, raising the question of whether it can actually be a successful opposition party through Trump's second presidency. The newly elected chair of the DNC, Ken Martin, has plenty of ideas, and he joins Michelle Martin to discuss them.
Ken Martin, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Obviously, when we arranged to have this conversation some time ago, our plan was to talk about your plans for the Democratic National Committee, to talk about some of the disagreements that Democrats have been having. But then, of course, over the last few days, we were confronted with the horrific, murder of State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, and also the wounding of State Senator John Hoffman and his wife. Thankfully, they seem to be recovering. But, you've known her for a long time. You're the former chair of the party in Minnesota. So if you would just give me a memory of Representative Hortman, a longstanding Speaker of the House, in fact, one of the longest serving, and undertook that position at a relatively young age. So what is your most significant memory of her?
Well, thank you, Michelle, for asking. And let me just say that obviously as a proud Minnesotan, my heart breaks obviously for all of my friends and colleagues back home in Minnesota. imagine, waking up to the news on Saturday, as I did and many Minnesotans, that there had been a shooting in Minnesota, only to find out later that it was at the homes of some legislators, and then only to find out later in the day that two of your very close friends, Melissa and Mark Hortman, who I've known over half of my life, were assassinated. And two of my other friends they attempted to murder them as well. And Melissa Hortman was an amazing change maker in our state. She won in 2004, came into the legislature and immediately started to climb the ranks. In 2018, when we won back the House majority, she became the speaker, one of our longest serving speakers, and frankly, one of the most consequential. When Tim Walz was put on the ticket by Kamala Harris last fall, the first call he made after getting the news was to Speaker Hortman. And what he said is, thank you. Thank you for all you did, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be on the ticket. And that's true, because so much of the remarkable legislation that passed in Minnesota, commonly referred to as the Minnesota Miracle, she was the architect of it. She was the person who not only pushed for it, but was persistent and relentless in making sure that other Democrats understood that power is fleeting, and that when you have power, you have to use it to make the biggest difference for as many people as you could. And so truly, she leaves an amazing legacy, a remarkable legacy that's going to impact generations of Minnesotans to come. And it's so devastating on a very personal level to lose someone I was so close to. But for the state, she was such an amazing leader. And our heart breaks. All Minnesotans, regardless of party, are just in pain right now. And I wish I was back home with them.
I would imagine so. Like you and like so many other people, I woke up to this news and, at first I was shocked. But then I thought, should I be shocked? I mean, if you think about it, over the last, months and few years, there were 2 assassination attempts directed at now President Trump. The governor of Pennsylvania's home was firebombed in the middle of the night while his family slept, not to mention the January 6th mob attack on the Capitol. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's shocking on the one hand, but is it really shocking?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, Michelle. And the reality is I hear people say in both this weekend and even before that this is not who we are as America. I would say, unfortunately, this is who we are, but it's not who we should be. And it's not who we need to be, meaning that we all have a responsibility. If you reject this type of violence and you don't want to see any more of it, we should acknowledge that this is who we've become as a country. But it does not mean this is permanent. It does not mean this is who we need to be. It requires all of us in this moment, Michelle, to speak out against political violence of any form or any kind.
So let me go back to what you think your role is right now. I don't know that, I would assume that you didn't run for the chairman of the Democratic National Committee so that you would be kind of offering condolences to the country at a time like this. But unfortunately, this is your task right now. But on a broader sense, what do you see as your role as chairman of one of the great, political parties in America?
Well, we're the oldest political party in this country, in the oldest and longest enduring democracy in the world. My role and responsibility right now is singular, and that's to win elections, to put us back into power, to actually help us stop this tyrant in the White House and what they're doing to destroy the values of this great country. And so what does that look like, of course? And, for me, it's a fierce focus on building the infrastructure everywhere. Our philosophy here is very simple. When you organize everywhere, you can win anywhere. And as a result, we've already started doing that. I'm 4 months on the job, Michelle, and we have overperformed or won in almost every special election on the ballot since Donald Trump was inaugurated. There's a huge opportunity in every crisis. And right now, that opportunity is that we can expand our coalition to many people in this country right now who either left our party, supported Donald Donald Trump and are having buyer's remorse, or people who have felt abandoned by our party right now. There's an opportunity to give them hope again that their better days are ahead of them, that the Democratic Party is fighting for them and their families and their communities.
Okay, you use the word crisis. What is the crisis for the Democratic Party? Is it a crisis of brand? Is it a crisis of message? Or is it a crisis of ideas?
I think it's all of it, if I'm being honest with you. But let me start with last spring. There was research, Michelle, that showed for the first time in modern history that the perceptions of the two political parties has flipped, that the majority of Americans now believe that the Republican Party best represents the interests of the middle class, the working class, and the poor, and the Democratic Party is the party of the wealthy and the elites. That is a damning indictment on our party for sure. And certainly, you know this as well as I do, Michelle. Most people in this country do not vote on policy and issues. They vote on perceptions and feelings. And there's many people in this country who are feeling forgotten, who are feeling left behind, and feeling like the Democratic Party does not represent them anymore, or isn't fighting hard enough for them in their communities. And so, that perception is going to take time to change. And so when I say there's a crisis of brand and identity right now. There's a crisis of perception. And we have to do a better job of giving people a sense that we're going to fight hard for them when we're back in power. And look, in this moment right now, Michelle, when things are so chaotic in Washington, D.C., we also have to stand up and fight against Donald Trump. And the reality is in 2016, someone said to me that the Republicans are shameless, but the Democrats are spineless. If we're not willing to stand up and fight hard against Donald Trump right now, how do we believe that the American voters are going to think that we would fight for them and their families if they put us back in power? But more importantly, I ask this question everywhere I go to Democrats. If we're not willing to stand up and fight like hell for the things we believe in, then the question is, do we really believe in them at all?
So whose fault is this?
I think it's everyone's fault. All of us who've been involved in this for many years. The reality is, Michelle, this is, not a singular occurrence of one election. We've been losing ground with people for years.
Because why? Because
right.
why?
Yeah, well, why I think is, there's a multitude of factors of why we've been losing ground, right? I would argue one is how we campaign. Right? We show up 3 to 4 months before an election. The first conversation we have with voters is asking them to do something for our party and candidates, which is to vote for us. Then we don't show up for 2 years again. And at the same time, we have the same conversation. And so voters don't believe that we actually care about them as people, as humans, that we don't really invest in their communities, that we're not invested in their success, right? And so, part of it is how we campaign. We need year-round organizing like we have in Minnesota, where the first conversation we have with voters is not transactional, but it's asking voters what their hopes and dreams are for their communities, and eventually building a relationship around shared values. And only after we've earned the right to ask for their vote, asking them to vote for our party and candidates. And so that, I would argue, one of the reasons we've lost is because of the way we treat voters and their communities as just commodities. The second reason I think we've lost trust is because when we get into office, we don't actually deliver on the promises we made.
So here's where I have to jump in here and just ask. A lot of your first 4 months in office has been taken up with, or at least that we publicly see, disputes with other members of the party, people like the outgoing Vice Chair, David Hogg. Some of what you're saying about Democrats sort of over-promising and under-delivering is exactly what he's been saying. So what's the source of the tension here?
Yeah, look, I've never had an issue with what David Hogg is talking about. I think primaries are really important. I think it's important to hold elected officials accountable, and I also think it's important to have primaries so we bring new voices into the party process. But let me be very clear. I pushed a neutrality pledge long before David Hogg was ever involved in Democratic politics. In 2017, after the 2016 election, I was the author of the superdelegate reform on the Rules and Bylaws Committee, and I also brought a neutrality pledge forward at that time, because I believe actually the way we win is by expanding our coalition through addition, not subtraction. And that
the neutrality pledge means what? That people who are part of the party apparatus shouldn't take sides in primaries?
Yeah, party officers should not be putting their thumb on the scale and picking winners or losers. Our job is to stay out of primary fights and let the will of the primary voters prevail. And then whoever they choose, without interference from party bosses, right, then we work like hell to get elected. Why does that matter to me? Because just like David, I believe we win through addition, not subtraction. We win by bringing people into the party, not by pushing them out. And that's how I've always led it.
Well, what was so dangerous about his idea? I mean, David Hogg is a young man who first came to public attention as a survivor of the Parkland High School shooting in Florida, which is where he went, and became active, as a lot of young people have, around the issue of gun violence because they are so directly affected in school shootings, which have also tragically become, commonplace. Okay, he's gone to college. He ran for this position in the party and had this notion of creating a PAC to try to encourage, to challenge incumbents who he felt or who people in the PAC felt were underperforming. Why is that such a bad idea, in your opinion?
I didn't say it was a bad idea. And I think what's important to understand is that you can't do both. You can't be the referee when your job is to actually create a fair and level playing field for all candidates and, frankly, their supporters, right? Without interference from party bosses, and then also be involved in a PAC that, in fact, is involved in primaries. You just can't do both. This was not a question of impugning his motives or what he's trying to do at all. Only to say that we also have a responsibility as party leaders. Our chief responsibility is to stay out of primaries because it's not up to us to influence it one way or another for an incumbent or a challenger. Our job is to stay out. Why is it important to stay out? It's because we don't want supporters of candidates to feel like their voice didn't matter, that they didn't have an opportunity to be heard, that they didn't have an opportunity to fairly compete for our party nomination. And if there's anything that's going to help us grow the party and bring new voices in, especially voices of younger people who are disillusioned with the party, it's making sure that party bosses are not putting their thumbs on the scale in any way, shape, or form. And so this is not about impugning David's motives at all. I'm a big fan of David Hogg's. Right? This has never been about David Hogg. Just the opposite. This has been about my longstanding belief, right, for many years that our party should be neutral in primaries and that our party should be inclusive.
I understand your point, but David Hogg was elected to that position just as you were. And if that's a different vision of other people in the party, I understand that you have a strong view of the matter, but he was elected just like you were. Why not just let it play out? And say that's your vision.
It did play out. It did play out, and David decided to resign his position before there was another vote.
A CBS News YouGov poll found that 71% of Democrats and 78% of Americans overall think the party has been ineffective in standing up to Trump. Focus groups led by Anat Shenker-Osorio found voters liken Republicans to lions and Democrats to sloths. So how do you shed that image of, passivity and show that the party can fight?
You got to get out there and fight. You got to grow a spine. People got to throw a punch, right? I mean, just a few weeks ago when there was a child who died of measles in Texas, I sent out a tweet that said Robert Kennedy murdered another child. The first people to complain, of course, were Democrats, right?
What did they complain about? What did they say?
Well, I'll tell you what some of them said. Well, we've got to preserve the option to work with these folks. We shouldn't be so aggressive in our messaging. I will tell you this. Now is not the time, when we see what's happening in this country, for Democrats to worry about offending someone, to throw a punch and then pull it back because we use the wrong words. You think that Republicans have any compunction when they get into office? No. They rush forward with their agenda. And at the end of the day, they don't care about offending Democrats or even working with Democrats. Now, look, Michelle, I'm not suggesting at the end of the day that we have to stoop to their level, that we have to lie, we have to exchange misinformation and disinformation. But gosh darn it, we do have to throw a punch. We do have to get out there and fight for our values. We do have to give people a sense that we actually are going to fight for them and their communities, because that's part of the reason why you see research like that. They don't believe the Democratic Party is actually actually going to stand up and fight hard for what they believe in. And at the end of the day, that contributes to those perceptions and feelings that the Democratic Party has abandoned them and their families.
And what about on something like immigration, where, clearly some of the behavior that this administration is engaging in is distasteful to many Americans, but other people agree with it. How would you recommend that Democrats navigate that?
Well, look, Democrats have said that we need border security. In fact, President Biden and others negotiated out with the most Republican, conservative member of the U.S. Senate, and James Langford from Oklahoma last year, a bipartisan deal to actually bring forward strict border security and immigration reform. Who killed that bill? Donald Trump. Donald Trump and the Republicans walked away from it. And guess what? They now have complete unified control of government. Where is their immigration bill? Where is their immigration policy to actually make sure that we have border security?
Well, they argue that their policy is mass deportation. That's not a secret. I mean, that's what they're doing. So
right, but my point is that policy is chaotic. It's dysfunctional. It's not actually helping us solve the issue on the border in any meaningful way. And the point that I'm trying to make to you is that, yes, the Republicans can talk all they want about actually putting policies forward. But what we're seeing on the streets when you're rounding up people indiscriminately, right? When you are essentially creating chaos around this issue, it's not a long-term solution. It might make you feel good to round people up and say you're deporting them. But look what's happening around this country. Even Donald Trump and the Republicans are losing ground on this issue because they don't believe that this is the right way to deal with immigration and to deal with deportation. We as a party, of course, we're ready and willing to have the conversation about immigration policy in this country and, of course, border security. The Republicans refuse to do it, and instead what they're doing is just inflicting chaos and dysfunction throughout this country through these mass deportations that aren't going to actually solve the issue. It's making it worse.
Ken Martin, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for talking with us. I do hope we'll talk again.
Thank you, Michelle.